Gotta say, when I saw that article you sent in, the one claiming UK weed is the best in the world, I was a little skeptical. Okay, maybe more than a little, but that's the beauty of these deep dives, right? We get to dig in, get our hands dirty with the details, and see if those bold claims hold up.
It's always good to question, to challenge those assumptions.
Exactly. So let's talk about weed. I mean, I'm guessing if you're listening, you've probably enjoyed your fair share of good bud, but have you ever stopped to think about where it comes from?
Where it comes from.
Yeah. And I don't just mean geographically, like, oh, this strain's from California, that one's from Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Talk about the history, the culture, the people, the techniques, all the things that go into creating that experience.
The story behind the bud.
Exactly. And let me tell you, the story of UK weed is way more interesting than I ever imagined.
Well, I'm not surprised. The UK has this whole rich history with cannabis that often gets overlooked.
Right. This article we're diving into claims British cannabis is top tier, and it builds this whole argument around their unique history with the plant, their impressive growing expertise, and this kind of rebellious, almost craft approach that sets them apart.
And it's a compelling argument. I mean,
Yeah.
we often associate weed with places like Amsterdam or California, right? But the UK has this whole other story dating back centuries.
Centuries. We're talking like really old school here.
Oh, yeah. Did you know that hemp cultivation in the UK goes all the way back to the Neolithic period?
Neolithic. We're talking like Stone Age hemp farmers here. What were they even using it for back then?
Exactly. And that's the thing. Back then, it wasn't about recreation. Hemp was essential. Think rope, textiles, food, even medicine.
Wow, so it was really a crucial resource.
Absolutely. It was vital for centuries, playing a huge role in shipbuilding and paper production well into the 16th century.
So we've got ancient hemp farmers, 16th century shipbuilders, all relying on this plant. So what changed? When did hemp go from everyday essential to, well, however you want to describe the perception of weed today?
Well, it's a classic tale of shifting perceptions, isn't it? As cannabis prohibition took hold in the 1920s, hemp got caught in the crosshairs.
Guilt by association.
Exactly. This plant that was once celebrated for its versatility was suddenly lumped in with marijuana and demonized. All those practical uses overshadowed by this new wave of fear-mongering. It's fascinating how quickly public opinion can shift, isn't it?
It really is. And just as the world was getting comfortable with this whole hemp is bad narrative, the 1960s swung in with a vengeance.
Ah, the swinging 60s.
Right. Suddenly, marijuana was the fuel for the counterculture movement, a symbol of rebellion, of social change. Everyone from artists to activists embraced it.
And you can't talk about 60s counterculture without talking about the UK music scene.
Oh, absolutely.
Think Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. They weren't just pushing musical boundaries, they were challenging social norms. And cannabis became synonymous with that spirit of rebellion.
It's funny how certain things become symbols, right?
Absolutely. And the article even highlights places like the UFO Club and the Roundhouse as hubs for this burgeoning UK cannabis culture.
Okay, so we've got ancient hemp farmers, 16th century shipbuilders, and now psychedelic rock stars. This UK weed story is already way more interesting than I expected. But let's be real, no conversation about UK weed would be complete without mentioning the legend himself, Howard Marks, a.k.a. Mr. Nice,
Quite the character.
to say the least.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy was an Oxford-educated cannabis smuggler who may or may not have offered Bill Clinton a joint. Can't make this stuff up.
It's certainly a story. But Mark's story also tells us a lot about how the UK weed market developed. In the 80s and 90s, Moroccan hash, was often called soap bar, flooded the market. It was easier to smuggle, and frankly, quality wasn't really the priority back then.
It was a different time.
It was. But then 9/11 happened, borders tightened, and those traditional smuggling routes were disrupted.
Things had to change.
They did. The market had to adapt, and that's where skunk, this potent new weed coming from Amsterdam, really took hold.
And this is where the UK's geography plays a key role, right? Being a hop, skip, and a jump away from the Netherlands meant that those Dutch refined genetics, especially skunk #1, quickly made their way across the pond, becoming a cornerstone of the UK scene.
Exactly. Proximity played a huge part in shaping the market.
But here's the thing that really stood out to me. UK growers didn't just import and replicate. They took those Dutch genetics and got to work.
They made it their own.
Exactly. They used their own ingenuity and expertise to develop their own unique strains.
And that's where the UK's long-standing gardening tradition comes into play. This is a country known for its meticulous gardens, its love of horticulture. That inherent understanding of plants, combined with the need for discretion, led to some truly innovative cultivation techniques.
It's giving very much dig for victory, but for weed. I'm picturing these meticulously kept gardens, but instead of roses and daffodils, it's rows of top-shelf cannabis hidden in plain sight. It really is like this hidden world of horticultural expertise all happening under the radar.
It is, and it's those UK growers who are often working in confined, hidden spaces that really impress me. They've had to master indoor growing techniques, maximizing yield in these small spaces, and consistently producing this high-quality product without drawing attention.
Right, like talk about resourcefulness.
Exactly. They've had to become masters of stealth and resourcefulness, and that's a big part of why UK weed is so highly regarded. I mean, some of the techniques and strains they've developed are legendary.
Absolutely. The article even mentions Exodus cheese, a British-developed strain that really put UK growers on the map. And it's all thanks to that mix of ingenuity and a deep, deep understanding of the plant itself.
It's a true testament to their skills.
It really is. Yeah. Speaking of ingenuity, you know what I found fascinating? There's a theory out there that even Shakespeare might have indulged in a little cannabis.
Shakespeare and weed, go on.
Right. Imagine the bard himself getting high and then writing A Midsummer Night's Dream. Makes you wonder if a little green inspiration was behind some of his most iconic lines.
Well, it's a fun thought, isn't it? Whether or not he was a cannabis enthusiast, it speaks to this long history of the plant being woven into culture, even art.
Totally. It really puts things in perspective.
Yeah, what?
But okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about where things stand today. We've explored this rich history, but what about the present-day UK weed scene? What makes it stand out in a world where everyone seems to be chasing the next big thing?
That's a really important question because if we're talking about the best weed in the world, we can't just look at history, right? We need to consider what's happening right now. And I think when you compare the UK scene to, say, the US scene, it's a fascinating clash of cannabis cultures.
Oh, totally. It's like this underdog story,
Yeah.
the UK with its small-scale growers and this we're doing it our own way attitude going up against this big, flashy, corporate-driven American cannabis market.
Exactly. It's this David and Goliath scenario.
Yeah.
The U.S. market is all about profit, chasing those high THC numbers, branding, mass production. Whereas the UK scene, it feels more grounded, more focused on quality, craft, and community. It's like they've carved out this little niche, this underground approach that's all about passion and respect for the plant.
And that's where things get really interesting because this article brings up some important questions about the downsides of that corporate cannabis approach. Like, it's not just about getting high, right? There's more to it than that.
Absolutely. When profit is the driving force, sometimes other things fall by the wayside. The quality of the product, the overall experience, even the potential medicinal benefits of different cannabinoids, it can get overlooked. The UK scene, with its emphasis on connoisseurship and small batch production, offers a different perspective on what makes good weed.
Totally. It's about the whole experience, the taste, the aroma, the effects, that whole journey from seed to smoke. It's a different mindset, a different way of thinking about cannabis altogether.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of consumer safety. I mean, the article mentions this joint investigation by the LA Times and Weed Week that found crazy high pesticide levels in a shocking number of U.S. cannabis products.
Yeah, that was a real eye-opener for a lot of people.
To say the least, I mean, that's a serious issue. It really highlights the potential risks of these unregulated markets.
It does. And while the UK market might also be illegal, it's smaller, more tightly knit. There's a sense of accountability there, a shared understanding of quality and trust within the community.
It's like the farm-to-table movement, but for cannabis.
Exactly.
You know your source, you know how it was grown, and you're supporting local growers, the local economy. It just feels more intentional.
It does. It's about knowing where your weed comes from, who grew it, how it was cultivated. That kind of transparency is hard to find in these massive corporatized industries where profit often comes first.
So if we come back to this article's central claim, is UK weed really the best in the world? Well, that's a tough one to answer definitively, but based on what we've learned, it's hard to deny there's something special about the UK scene. It's wild, right? When you really dig into it, the world of UK weed is so much more than meets the eye.
It really is. From ancient hemp fields to hidden indoor gardens, who knew there was so much history, so much passion packed into this little plant?
Right. And what I find really fascinating is how, even with all the changes in the world, the UK weed scene has held on to this sense of tradition, of community, of doing things their own way.
They've really managed to preserve that connection to the plant itself, to the art of cultivation. It's becoming increasingly rare, wouldn't you say?
It really is. It's like that rebellious spirit we talked about earlier, the one that fueled the counterculture movement. It's still alive and well. You see it in those hidden gardens, those DIY grow setups.
It's true. And in a world where everything's becoming so standardized, so mass-produced, driven by corporate profits, that independent spirit is refreshing.
Totally. Makes you think, right? Is bigger always better? Is the future of cannabis just about chasing the highest THC percentages, the flashiest packaging, the biggest brands? Or is there another path? One that values quality over quantity, craft over commerce, connection over just consuming?
Well, I think that's the question, isn't it? Maybe this underground approach, this UK way of doing things, offers us a glimpse into a different kind of future for cannabis.
A different kind of future.
One that's less about corporate profits and more about community, about truly appreciating the plant and all its nuances, preserving those traditions and expertise that have been passed down for generations.
Now that's a future I can get behind. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I got to ask you, what's the verdict? Is UK weed the best in the world?
Honestly, that's for each individual to decide, isn't it? But I think what we can say is this. UK weed represents something unique, something special.
What do you mean?
It's a reminder that sometimes the best things, they're worth seeking out. Even if they're not the most readily available or the most widely marketed, it's about the journey, the history, the passion, the dedication to the craft. All of that goes into every bud.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And for anyone listening, the next time you find yourself with a moment to, spark up, take a second, just think about the journey that little bud took to get to you. The history, the culture, the passion, it's all there, rolled into one tiny package.
It really is remarkable when you think about it that way.
It is. And hey, maybe you'll even find yourself inspired to seek out some locally grown goodness. Support those artisans, the innovators, who are keeping the spirit of craft cannabis alive wherever you are in the world.